Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. And we are taking another look at 20th Century Boys. We are going to talk about an interesting development in the story today. Let's start with a brief recap. Last time we were getting a lot of the truth of Bloody New Year's Eve, the incident at the end of the year 2000 when Kenji disappeared and when the rest of his friends kind of scattered to the four winds. We know that Yukiji was left in charge of Kana, and they have kind of carried forward into the future. And we know that Acho was captured and has been in jail basically ever since. But Acho manages to escape with the help of a mangaka prisoner and a young lady named Kiyomi is she runs into Kami-sama, the cognizant homeless man that we met earlier in the story. And through these two sources, Acho and Kami-sama, we get a pretty good idea of what happened during Bloody New Year's Eve. And we left off with Kenji and Acho and Maro in a truck full of dynamite going to destroy the robot that the FDP was using to execute a simulated terrorist attack. I suppose it was a real terrorist attack. It's just the FDP was pretending not to be in charge. At the beginning of the next chapter, we finally get a couple of big reveals. We see what the robot actually was, and it's really a pretty good metaphor for this story up to this point. It's not a shiny, cool robot like Tetsujin 28 or some of the other giant robo series that the kids liked watching when they were young in the late 60s and early 70s. Rather, it's just a clanking mass of really crude machinery, definitely not powered by nuclear energy, and really not as big as it looks. It's actually a set of robotic legs with a blimp attached to it, basically. And they've draped a big piece of cloth over top to hide this deception from the world. Yes, it's scary and it's very dangerous, but it is not at all what it appears to be at first glance. And that is a perfect summary of the story up to this point, where our protagonists, when they were thinking about their future, they saw a very bright, exciting, gleaming picture of things to come. And as they got closer and closer and closer, it looked shoddier and shoddier and shoddier, and it was just very disappointing. And Kenji, he gets pissed when he sees this thing. He's like, this is not what we were looking forward to. I think it's really, no one ever, well, maybe it's a little on the nose. Kenji literally describes the robot as not the future they were hoping for. And that is kind of the thrust of the first act of this story. The future is not necessarily what you hope for, and it's going to look a lot more jury-rigged and crude the closer you get to it. But there is more to it than that. And I think the robot actually, as the story progresses, is a good metaphor for the themes that Urasawa is trying to address in this story. Anyways, the FDP shows up at the Diet as the Prime Minister is trying to decide how to respond to this giant robot that has shown up in the middle of the city. And they tell him they have a vaccine for the disease that the robot is spreading, and they are distributing doses as fast as they can. They tell the Prime Minister and his government, we've already done all of these checks on this. The FDP is a political faction in good standing, so they are taken at their word because it is an emergency situation. And in fact, the vaccine has to work because the FDP later leverages this to gain power. So while there are some interesting similarities to recent events and this particular part of the story, ultimately, this is not that kind of conspiracy theory. We'll just say that. Manjome, the face of the FDP, tells the Prime Minister, "Okay, we're gonna give out this vaccine to cure the disease for the good of all mankind." And Friend from the FDP has taken a monument that they have been constructing for the new party headquarters and goes out to confront the robot. And this monument is an important part of the story going forward as well, because while the robot is kind of a metaphor for the themes of the story, the monument is a metaphor for the motivation of Friend. And there's this really great shot of Friend driving. Supposedly, he's in the cab of this truck. Whether he is or not is an open question. But supposedly, he's in the cab of this truck, driving this monument towards the robot to smash it and wreck it, um, thus presenting the spread of the disease and slowing down the terrorist attack. And according to Acho and Kami-sama, these two massive vehicles collide. There's an explosion supposedly set off by the dynamite, although much larger than the dynamite really accounts for. Several city blocks are leveled, and that's the end of the incident. Everybody runs. They are panicked. They are frightened, and they never quite come together again, except, of course, for Yukiji and Kana, who were together before the climactic encounter. And that is the end of Bloody New Year's Eve. It's an interesting story, but again, it doesn't really feel like a climax to the story, which is why I think it's good that the first act ends the way it does, and then we get this additional knowledge about Bloody New Year's Eve as kind of the exposition portion of the second act, rather than as the climax of the first act. So really good structure there. I really admire Urasawa, how deftly he manages his pacing, his tempo, and the tone and tenor of his story. This all works really well. When we arrive back in the present and this recounting is done, Kiyomi decides she doesn't really want to do a report on Bloody New Year's Eve anymore because she's dealing with some pretty scary stuff. Obviously, there was a huge conspiracy to help the FDP gain power by handing out these vaccines in response to the bio attacks. And the FDP is the ruling party in Japan now. So if she talks any about what she's learned, especially being just a high school student, she's going to get in trouble. The problem is when she tries to change the subject of her paper, she's told it doesn't matter anymore. Because she's been given the option to go to Friendland. And Friendland is essentially a brainwashing facility. So Kiyomi's kind of in trouble. But we don't come right back to that. We do get an interesting coda to this episode, which is Kana has this old Walkman that has some of Kenji's music on it, and she plays it for Detective Cho. And it's an interesting bit here. There will be a lot of callbacks to the song that Kenji is playing through the rest of this story. And while there's not a lot good to say about the live-action adaptation of 20th Century Boys, I am curious how they handled this song, because it's such an important aspect of the story. And of course, there's no music, there's no sound at all in manga. There is actually chords with this, so I suppose you could figure out how to play this. It includes both lyrics and chords, so that's pretty neat. But I've never heard this performed. But it is supposedly Kenji's greatest achievement, and it will be called back to a lot. And this ending moment where Cho hears it for the first time, and you see him crying, but his only comment is, "Boy, is he a lousy singer." And then he and Kana watch the sunrise over Tokyo, is very interesting, because it is, again, kind of in a nutshell. That is, if the monument encapsulates Friend's theme through the story, Kenji is encapsulated by this song and the way people react to it. It is not particularly unique. It is performed competently. Maybe Kenji isn't the best vehicle for it, but its sincerity and its simplicity really moves people. And I think at this point, Kenji and Friend are opposite numbers. They are mysterious figures who have inspired people to different kinds of actions, and who we have to kind of try and understand through these themes and through the ways they have inspired other people. That's always been the case with Friend, but it's going to be the case for Kenji for a while yet. After this, there is an aside where we are reintroduced to the UN scene. Once again, we see the saviors of the world approaching, being welcomed at the UN, and we finally get to see who they are. It is, of course, the leaders of the FDP in all their sinister glory. These are the people who have conspired and schemed and murdered and scratched and clawed their ways to power, and they finally have it. They are viewed as heroes by the rest of the world. Friend himself makes a video message. He's shown as injured and recovering. Whether this is true or not is not really clear at this point. I suspect Friend was not in that truck. I don't think he was ever hurt. He clearly gamed all of this out beforehand, so I think he's going to be okay. But ultimately, we have to go with Kiyomi Koizumi to Friendland. And let me just stop for a moment and talk a little bit. I'm not an expert on this topic, but let me talk a little bit about the original language in this story. Friendland here is referred to just as Friendland. It's important to note that the word, and you can actually see it in some of the art because there are like signs that are hand-drawn that are not changed in here. But you can see here the sign actually says Tomodachi Land. Tomodachi is a word that refers specifically to a childhood friend, a friend you made before adolescence, while you were in grade school, or maybe even before grade school, and that you knew probably for a fairly lengthy period of time. Now, you may refer to somebody you have known for or let's say you spent one semester at a school before you had to move for some reason. I don't know if you would refer to the brief acquaintances you had there as a tomodachi, as a friend. But in general, this particular kind of relationship is special in Japan. There is a lot of weight put behind it, and because it's such a small country, and people do not move as much there as they do, for example, in the United States or even in Europe, tomodachi are people you will probably know your whole life. And it implies such a long-standing intimacy, especially when used among adults, that the relationship is just, it's not really possible for it to be equaled by other relationships, even though the tone and the tenor will be kind of different. And of course, this being called out here is interesting because Kenji and Maro and Acho and all of our protagonists, they're tomodachi. They've known each other since they were very young, since they were elementary students, perhaps before. That part is not entirely clear. Friend's use of the word here signals something to us. Now, I'm not sure exactly which form of the Japanese word our friend uses to refer to himself. I don't know if he's a tomodachi, if some other form of the word is used, or if he refers to himself as a nakama, which is a kind of friendship that implies camaraderie from a shared purpose or a shared sense of meaning. I would be interested to look that up. It's also possible that he refers to himself using the English word friend. Sometimes that will be done to lend a weight of exoticism or mystery to a person, and that is clearly part of our friend's appeal in this story. But here in Tomodachi Land, we see that once again, Friend is obsessed with the past. He's obsessed with his childhood in some way that we don't fully understand. And in Friendland, this indoctrination center, they put Koyomi through a bunch of weird VR games. where they do a bunch of grueling physical activities. But the most interesting part is a VR shooter type game where the participants are attacked by VR versions of Kenji and the rest of his friends who were part of his underground cell just before Bloody New Year's Eve. And so we see Kiyomi has to, shoot at him with his light gun and do all this other stuff. And she's not doing very well at all these games. But the really important thing comes after that, because when it becomes clear that she's failing at the games, and her leader there, the chief dream navigator, this lady here, I forget her name, but I just usually thought of her as the creepy navigator lady. She's going to get in trouble if she cannot do very well at these games. And then she runs into a janitor. A janitor. Is that meaningful? Is that important? Well, yes. Yes, it is. And I really love this moment because we are about to meet an old friend of ours. There's that word again. And it's not going to be anything like what we expected. So where is that moment? I really like this because the first time I was reading it, I almost missed it. So here we have a moment. Kiyomi blows her nose and she tosses her Kleenex, and this janitor just comes out and he sweeps it up, and then he hustles off. It's a weird moment, but we spend 2 whole panels on it, which means it's got to be important somehow. So I went back and I looked at it again, and I was suspicious. But it wasn't until we see him pop up again. Where is that moment? And again, there's a Kiyomi is a less serious character. A lot of her situations are quite comedic. She goes into the baths, and we see the janitor kind of peeping in at her. And this is a funny moment. This is a common gag in manga for some reason. I guess it is most manga is of course aimed at adolescents, and that is something that adolescents try and do. They try and peep at each other sometimes. But in this moment, the thing we see the most is the glasses. And if you remember last time, we looked at the cover. There's a guy with glasses on the front. It's Yoshitsune. And yes, that janitor is Yoshitsune. And it's really interesting because Yoshitsune was always this background character. He was always meek. He was always quiet. He was always kind of fidgety. And now he's slipped his way back into the story almost completely under our radar. It's a very Yoshitsune kind of thing to do. That's very interesting. Very interesting, because Yoshitsune has a great character arc in this story, and we're going to talk a little bit about it here, and we'll talk a little bit about it in the next volume, but we won't really get to the peak of his character arc until volume 7. So just hold on to that for now. Another thing to hold on to is this guy. This guy is an enka singer. That is a kind of traditional Japanese folk music, and he is singing. As I mentioned last time, the 2015 World Expo is being held in Japan, and he is singing the theme song, which is clearly based on the theme song from the 1970 World Expo, World's Fair. Excuse me, not Expo, World's Fair. And this is another one of those cases where Urasawa is working very far ahead. This singer, he's important, but not yet. And just having him show up singing on his propaganda channel at Tomodachi Land is a great way to introduce him to us, because you really don't think anything of it, except for the fact, like, there's 2 whole pages basically dedicated to introducing this character. Anyways, Kiyomi is trying to escape from Tomodachi Land. And as she does, she's not the only one. There's this other girl trying to escape. The Dream Navigator decides she's going to Tomodachi World, and Kiyomi is, of course, worried that if she's caught, she'll also be sent to Tomodachi World. And as she's trying to sneak out, she runs into, of course, Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune is running the Underground Railroad, basically. He's become a janitor here at Tomodachi Land. He knows a lot of the staff. He is quietly helping kids escape or sending them back in to do intelligence gathering for him. Because Yoshitsune has become he's become something very different from the character we knew, who was afraid, who let others figure out how to do things and then show him what to do. Now Yoshitsune, believe it or not, is a leader. He leads a bunch of kids, not kids anymore, but they were at the time, who were orphaned on Bloody New Year's Eve, and he is out to figure out what happened, why it happened, and how they can stop it from happening again. He's trying to figure out the mystery of who our friend is, and he wants Kiyomi to help him. If you get the highest scores, one of the 3 highest scores in the Tomodachi Land games, you will go to a special bonus stage. And Yoshitsune has helped one other person get there. Unfortunately, he came out of the process brainwashed. So it was very difficult to get any kind of meaningful information from him. All he found was a note that said, "I met my friend and we played." Again, that's a very important language. And he found a Teru Teru Bozu, which is one of these things here. It's kind of a lucky charm for good weather, although they're usually not that big. Usually they're about, the size of your hand. When you see one blown up that large, it looks kind of sinister, like a hanged man or a ghost. So, of course, Yoshitsune was disturbed by this, but he couldn't ask the kid any questions because the brainwashing had kind of overridden his original personality and his promise to help. But Kiyomi is going to try and get in there, and eventually she does. We see her in this VR program, and it turns out to be something a lot more innocent. Oh, I should mention, before we get into the VR program, because this is one of the things that threw me off when we first read it. When we get to the VR program, Yoshitsune mentions that when he's had other kids that have helped him with this before, and one of them who went into this game never came out of the VR room, and when Yoshitsune got in there to clean it up, he found a puddle of blood. Now this was really confusing to me at first, and it led to some misunderstandings that made this part a little bit sketchy to me the first time I read it. Actually, on my second reading here, it makes a lot more sense. And I started a reread of 20th Century Boys probably about 3 or 4 years ago, but I had to drop it before I got to this point, unfortunately. One of my big issues with this was, well, we'll get to that. We'll talk about it more in Volume 6, because this storyline carries over into the next volume. Anyways, so about the Yomi's experience, she goes back to 1970, and this is actually a pretty big important plot point, because she goes back in time. She meets the kids, and she goes to a haunted house on the hill with Kenji and some of the other kids. Now, most of the gang went to the World's Fair because it's 1970, but some of them are here at home. And they go up to the hanging hill where a person supposedly hung themselves in a house, and they find a giant Teru Teru Bozu on the stairs. And Kiyomi goes up to this Teru Teru Bozu, and she figures, well, okay, this was just a prank here on the haunted hill. I guess the kids just did something weird this summer. She doesn't understand why this is important. But she goes to take a closer look at the Teru Teru Bozu, and she sees the feet of some kids sticking out from under there. And she realizes that this is probably someone important. In the meantime, as she goes to see who these kids are, thinking she'll be fine because it's a VR game, Yoshitsune has come to realize, he remembers this time period, And it's prompted by recalling the Teru Teru Bozu he saw himself. And he remembers this incident, and he realizes that friend was at this incident on the house on Hanging Hill. And he realizes that if Kiyomi sees the face of our friend by investigating here, she's probably just going to be summarily executed by the FDP. So he runs off to try and intervene. And we end on twin shots of Yoshitsune panicked and running to try and shut down the VR program before Kiyomi can see our friend's face. And then a shot of her looking past a curtain or perhaps the skirts of the Teru Teru Bozu to see we don't know what. This is one of the great suspense panels that Urasawa is capable of. He's really good at setting up these moments where we really want to know what's going to happen next, but we'll have to wait till we turn the page or till the next issue comes out, or in this case, until we look at the next volume, which hopefully will not be that far from now. I am a little bit behind where I want to be. So, this volume does a lot to advance our characters, our understanding of the world and the story, but most of all, it shows the depth and the intricacy of the story we are dealing with. I love that Yoshitsune comes back in this way that is perfectly emblematic of his character, while at the same time we are advancing our understanding of the FDP, of their motives, of how deeply the neuroses of our friend have infused that organization. We're seeing really dark parts of the world as we explore this brainwashing facility. And we are getting a sense of who Kiyomi is, even though she's not a character that's super important to the plot overall. We are seeing this part of the story through her eyes, expressly so. We get a sense of who she is, how she matters, because she's going to be very important in the next section as well. So who she is, how she matters, and at the same time, we're getting a look through the eyes of a normal person at this really dystopian part of the world. So the story is working on so many levels. It's very complicated. It's very rich in character information. It introduces a character we kind of know already, but puts him in a whole new light. Yoshitsune has taken all of these skills, all of these ideas, all of these tricks he learned from everyone else when he was a middle-aged salaryman, and as he is beginning to age into a position of a venerable leader, he is applying them with a kind of vigor, with a perceptiveness, and with a wisdom that I would not have credited him with when he was younger. Clearly, this is a person who has matured and changed a lot in the years since Bloody New Year's Eve. We are going to see a lot more of that going forward, but at the same time, he's not a totally different person. Yoshitsune has always been insecure. He has always doubted himself. He has always looked to the older, bigger, smarter, faster, cooler friends of his for leadership. And now that he is a leader, even though he's leading these people, even though he is just as cool in the eyes of his followers as those people were in his eyes, he hasn't lost any of those insecurities. He leads in spite of them, and he's cool in spite of his shortcomings. And it's really great to see Urasawa balance that kind of character development, which can be very hard to do. I really love the Tomodachi Land arc and several more of the story beats that will involve Yoshitsune. I think that he has the strongest character beats of any character outside of Kana herself, and maybe some other characters we'll discuss in the future. But personally, in the second act of the story, Yoshitsune is in fact my favorite character because we learn so much about him. We learn about all the things he's overcome and how he's become a very admirable character, a very admirable man, in fact. which you wouldn't have thought was possible the way he was depicted before. So this is a great installment in the story. This story is still firing on all thrusters, in my opinion, and I cannot wait to talk about Volume 5 with you. But we're going to have to, because that's all there is for today. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and subscribe button there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.